Thanks everybody for joining us. Got it. Thanks for everybody for joining me this morning. I'm Tim Jones with Forescout. I'm on the call. I've also got Tom May with Forscout. So wanted to take a moment and thank everybody for joining us this morning. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the background of Forescout. I know I'm looking at some of the people that are out here. Looks like I've got a couple familiar faces, but I wanted to make sure everybody kind of had a background of what Forescout does today. And then talk a little bit about how we're working with some of the customers of Forescout as they go through kind of their zero trust journey. And then how obviously Forescout would interact with some of the peers and some of our partners and some of the vendors in the lab that I know you guys are trying to put together. That Forescout's been a part of some of the initial conversations up to this point on. So again, welcome. Kind of background about what Forescout's doing. There's a lot of things to consider when we're getting into some of the zero trust conversations. It's taking that defense in depth and going a little bit deeper than just the who, the what, and the where. What we've been starting to kind of look at on our side is understanding a little bit deeper the regulatory requirements that are going to start to move kind of, we've kind of said up and through into this model where zero trust is definitely going to be a requirement for most organizations, and they're going to be looking at teams that are going to show up and be able to provide all of this information and establish not only the who's but the what's and where they may be within their environment. And that's where Forscout really starts to shed a light on as to what's going on. What we're looking at from our perspective is kind of establishing some of that first level defense around what's connecting, where is it physically located, and maybe it's a logical location, understanding maybe that asset's compliance status when it is connecting. We can quickly establish and identify who's logged in and what asset may be compliant as we start to kind of move it through a process or establish a role around the zero trust modeling. We're going to add in different layers around the solutioning, maybe including risk compliance. Have I established and looked at, is the asset operating properly? Do I understand, maybe some vulnerabilities? Have I queried some of those vulnerabilities assessment tools? Are any of those assessments critical? These are all parts of the Forescout process that don't necessarily make up our tool, but are going to be critical as we start to kind of build out even further out that automated workflow that a lot of teams are trying to establish around their zero trust portfolio. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully I'm not walking past too much of it. The piece, this is kind of that utopian. This is maybe where you'd start to establish, a model around zero trust and start to bring in some of those tenants and some of those portfolio products that you have today and better kind of strengthen and establish, what it is that you want to do with those components. From a Forescout, success is not going to end with you doing it once. We're going to do this in a continuous model. Why this security challenge exists. We've been dealing with security regulations, security policies, all the risk management and security tools. These are all, common things that most teams have today in their environments. The reality is, though, most of the things over a period of time are going to start to shift. And we've seen this time and time again as Forscout's been involved in a lot of large enterprises, but the device life cycle, applications come and go, people and users' accounts start to modify and change. There's even this notion of kind of this device decay that starts to happen. And maybe you've even gone out and acquired, other technologies and other tools as you started down the zero trust path. These are all parts of this conversation that are a reality when you start to look at the landscape that people are looking at. And that's what drives this kind of gap or this misalignment. And that needs to be overcome as part of your zero trust strategy. So what Forescout's trying to establish is giving you that security framework that's going to help provide some visibility across where you bring your digital reality kind of back into some level of alignment. It operates continuously. It gets established to help kind of maintain that level of alignment. And we do that through a few different ways that we've established through different mechanisms, working with a variety of different customers in both the federal civilian as well as DoD, as well as large commercial accounts across those enterprises, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the core tenets of Forescout that we think we play a critical role in when we're looking at some of the zero trust models and tenets. But it starts with the discovery and understanding that inventory of all of those cyber assets that are going to be out there, right? We're one of the only vendors that can offer that kind of continuous rediscovery of all of your cyber assets across a variety of different planes and locations. We've been chosen by multiple groups to kind of provide that, solutioning across, vast, large enterprises to, operational technology environments, to hybrid environments where you're dealing with both on-prem, cloud, data centers, virtualization. These are all parts of the Forescout, classification, understanding the discovery of all of those assets, and then figuring out, hey, how am I going to automate some level of this contextual information so that we can make a better decision and be able to kind of leverage that insight that Forescout's had about that asset. I know in Zero Trust, there are going to be multiple pillars or understandings. When we go through my slides here in a minute or two, we'll talk about some of that background, but leveraging that insight to kind of figure out, hey, how does this asset work within my organization? And how do I want to figure out the zero trust profile that I'm going to put around it? It needs to happen pretty quickly, and it has to happen pretty consistently. And that's what Forscout's goal is trying to establish some of those abilities, going forward. Once you have that contextual awareness of what's going on around and what's coming into the enterprise, the next big thing from our perspective is that level of assessment, right? Hey, can I take a look at some of this information? Do I have kind of that next step that I want to take with this device? And that starts the building blocks for zero trust. When we start to kind of look at, a lot of the vendors that are presented on this Friday, kind of lunch and learn is what I call it. A lot of that conversation is, hey, here's how we start to add some of that value into the complexity. And from a Forescout perspective, it's taking that assessment and moving that asset and understanding the compliancy and risk and hygiene in that continuous manner so that you have the ability to start to add some functional requirements that you want to see in your zero trust approach into your organization, right? You're not going to be able to go out and instantly just turn on zero trust. We've all heard that 100 times. It's not something that you're going to buy, but it's an approach that you're going to have to establish. And Forscout's trying to help you bring some of that identification and the prioritization around some of those assets when we start to map in other components around those devices, whether it's patch levels or users or the types of information that maybe they're trying to connect to within the enterprise. That's all going to be part of that larger zero trust approach. Forescout, implemented this across multiple organizations today. We've provided lots of alerts and a lot of information. And then what the goal is that we'd be able to kind of group and add some of that asset type and information and role mapping back so that we'd understand, hey, this is what these organizations are trying to do and establish within my enterprise. I want to know that the device classifications and the prioritization of what I want to protect is what I'm looking at in my zero trust approach. And that's a critical component. We'll talk a little bit more about, why that's going to be so important, but we want to make sure that we're protecting those things that are going to be kind of critical to the organization. And it's understanding kind of those flows and understanding that prioritization is going to be quick. All right, so let me get through a little bit more of this. The other part is obviously we've looked a lot at the modeling up to this point, and now it starts to apply some information to take that device from being trusted into, untrusted into some level of trust. And it's a proactive remediation or kind of those steps around misconfiguration that are going to help us with establishing some of that structure, right? What I need to know is, hey, how do I take this, specific control? I've got to, pinpoint some level of action so that I'm not going to impact other teams if I make this decision about one of these components. How am I going to actually enforce the zero trust security role that I'm going to place around some of those assets, around the requirement, around the posture, around the compliancy that's going to make this work for me continuously, right? It's easy to do it once. It's easy to kind of draw it out in a diagram, but to look at it and modeling it and making sure if I make these changes and understand what the requirements are, how do I do that consistently without having to deal with a lot of human intervention? Time is precious, right? We're losing millions and millions of moments in our security journey yearly around cybersecurity, right? We're spending time on things and events that don't necessarily, work through. What we need to figure out is how do I negate some of those components? How do I limit when something bad does happen? And how do I make sure I bring everybody back in so that that cyber asset is moved into the right, into the right region or right segment as quickly as I possibly can. Sounds like somebody's got a live mic still in the background. If we can mute that person. Thanks. All right, so getting through a little bit more of the component and conversation around what Forscout's also trying to establish as we work through this governance around zero trust is I want to be able to share this information and the context around what we've found across the enterprise. So this is a really critical component of the zero trust lab work, I think, that a lot of teams are trying to establish, and understanding, hey, how do I use the tools that any given customer is established in? We've made these investments in the security product. We probably have teams and groups that understand how to operate them. It's maybe thinking a little bit differently about how those tools could actually be augmented and brought into some of the components. One of the conversations we have multiple times is, hey, how do I accelerate some of those responses? Can I enforce a policy that every time I see this type of machine, I'm automatically going to know it needs to have this type of profile. It's going to expect to see these types of ports and services. And when something differs from that, who needs to know that information? It may go to a variety of teams. And we'll talk about some of the workflows that we've already established at Forescout around zero trust and how we've established that kind of that policy modeling. We have a policy engine inside of Forescout that helps us do some of that accelerated response, right? I'm not waiting for maybe the full response to come back from the tool, but I've notified the tool and I have opened myself up for more information that may come back into Forescout from any one of these given tools as well. All right, so if you hadn't heard it yet, this is kind of my who is Forescout. Hopefully we've got a couple more people on the call by now. We've been around for several years, about 20 years now. We've been actually now headquartered in Dallas, Texas. We've got a huge number of people that are already using and trusting Forescout to provide some of this context. And we've been managing kind of the cyber risk and automation based on some of the information that we're seeing around those assets. And have been doing this for years and years, right? We've got a really large, diverse customer case study. We've had multiple experiences around doing this at scale. We've also had this in pretty complex environments as well. So this is not a first time zero trust conversation for Forescout. We've been doing this pretty effectively for quite some time. What's changed from a Forescout perspective? And this is kind of the next stage in this conversation that I wanted to make sure I laid out today for you guys, is that we're actually getting asked differently about zero trust now than I think we've ever had, in the history of zero trust, right? Most everybody knows and understands kind of notionally that this concept's been out for a while, but I think most organizations are starting to kind of look at in the last most recent time is this understanding, hey, how am I going to be compliant going forward in the federal civilian? And I'll use this as an example, but it's not the only one around, hey, what do I need to do to make sure that I understand what those cyber security principles are that I should be working back towards. Some of this might seem pretty familiar, that identity and device, network environment, some of the data requirements. Look, I don't know of any single one solution that's going to touch them all, but it's understanding how I'm going to take kind of what we've been doing traditionally and how am I going to optimize some of that. When I looked at some of the diagrams and looked at some of the maturity pieces, obviously my job in federal is to help figuring out how groups are going to transition more and more toward the zero trust approach to their governance around what they're doing within their enterprises. So DHS's security model is a great, conversation starter. I think it aligns directly back to what you guys are establishing, right? So when I looked at, and I was doing this last night, you see these call outs, right? When I look at what Forscout's been asked to talk about in most of these environments, it's the device and endpoints, right? It's the network environments. It's, went back to the other side. It's going back through and having an understanding of, how do I look and understand how am I going to automate or orchestrate some of these components, right? Not every product is a SOAR, but every product inside of the zero trust conversation should know, hey, maybe how I interact with the SOAR, or how do I interact with some of these devices that are going to try and become a SOAR down the line. Those are the conversations that most teams in mature environments around the zero trust are starting to have. How do I take the tools that I have established today and I can start to kind of build on some of that? One of the work that we did initially at Forescout, we actually got very much involved in some of the NIST 800-207 artifacts. This was a very vendor neutral zero trust architecture that was embraced. And it's been fascinating, but what I wanted to kind of point out and why I think it's kind of really a great conversation starter as we start to talk about what Forscout's looking at, it established kind of this model around a couple different planes. When you look at the data plane on the blue section on the bottom of this diagram, you see a traditional environment that most everybody's working through and trying to understand how zero trust models are going to work, right? I look at a system and it's untrusted, and I want to move it to a level of trust. And most organizations are looking at some kind of policy enforcement point to do part of that conversation. What we've done and what we've been really excited to see is a lot of times a really maturing zero trust model is going to take into some level of consideration. Before I move from the untrusted to a trusted, I'm going to pass through this policy decision point. I'm going to have to go through and understand, do we have an engine? Do we have a mechanism for us to go through and understand what it's going to take for that device to move from trusted to untrusted as part of that process, right? NIST in their modeling has kind of taken them at an extended level out, right? They've built some other tools that are going to be part of that policy decision point. Some of those tools are functionality that we provide at Forescout, but some of these are functionality that a lot of the other tool vendors that are going to be part of these lab zero trust approach are going to be required to be able to provide it and functionally support, right? So back to the policy decision point, I wanted to kind of call out this section because I think it warrants a discussion when you go to start to establish some of these operational rules and requirements. And I know that's going to be part of the lab conversation down the line with these teams, is how do I build a model and understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish? What do I establish? What are the rules that are going to govern, parts of these components? Is this an authorized action? And if it is an authorized action, who needs to be involved in that conversation? It's probably not going to be one or a single group, but there needs to be some level of authority that's going to actually then establish and put that rule in place. And it's that understanding that policy engine that's going to be ultimately responsible for making that decision and granting access to any of those given subjects that's going to be critical. And look, there may be multiple PDPs that ultimately get established across these environments, but it's understanding the difference between those data planes, right? Your PEPs and your PDPs are going to look and feel a little bit different just because of where they're going to have to sit around the zero trust architecture. I don't know why it keeps kicking me back to my last slide. Apologize about that, guys. There you go. So as part of that control plane, Forscout's trying to establish some of our, understanding. What we've looked at, in the past is kind of how do I build out some of this dynamic enforcement and logic that makes sense around segmentation or, IT asset? How do I build some of that taxonomy so that I understand the policy flows going forward? We've got a variety of devices. Forscout's seeing all of them, right? I understand where those network, view may look. Simple IP address, maybe it's a MAC address, maybe it's something else as part of that conversation. I can go through some level of business logic and understand the classification, and then moving them into some logical business groups that are going to help me understand what zero trust modeling I'm going to have to do or establish around those specific things. I may very, have different rules about how I'm handling like a video surveillance, device versus an IP camera versus somebody's desktop, right? And that's the reality that a lot of these organizations are facing today when they're trying to implement some of this. How are we going to start to establish that? It's through doing some of the traffic analysis. It's understanding what those devices are. It's understanding the ports and services and the communication that's going to take place. These are all components that Forescout's going to help start to establish. We'll talk a little bit more about this as part of the conversation in the view in our lab or in our demo portion, but it's understanding the policy and the design and what we want to simulate and what we want to see as part of that conversation. Ultimately, we may not be the only enforcement model. Forscout fully acknowledges that we can enforce some of those pieces, but we may need to look at some of the other components that are out there to help us establish some of that zero trust modeling, whether it's agent-based or whether it's perimeter-based or whether it's network-based or even virtual-based. These are all going to be requirements that you're going to have to establish as part of your zero trust governance, right? It needs to happen continuously, and we need to kind of ensure that there's some validation that's taking place across all of those rules that you're going to put in place. So this is where all of that starts to kind of fill in at the control plane level. These things are going to help you move those devices from untrusted to trusted. And that very well may be an action that the PEP will take, right, as part of that process. It's moving those components around and understanding how some of the life cycle that's going to have to be added as part of that additional security context so that we have a more robust security model when we start to build out some of these zero trust architectures. Here's just kind of some of the understanding that Forescout works today on, right? We don't do it all. We've got a lot of integration with a lot of partners and a lot of teams that we've worked through. We fully recognize that, zero trust is going to be kind of a team effort. But if we want to get to some of those policy-driven security controls, we're going to have an understanding of, the reality that all of these PEPs exist. And that's, part of that conversation. So listen, thank you so much. That's the extent of my presentation. I'm going to pause there for you guys. And before I hand it off to kind of a demo from Tom May, who's on the call with us from Forescout as well, I'll pause if there's any quick questions you guys have about the slide deck. Sounds like no. Okay, not a problem. So Tom, I'm going to hand it over to you if you want to take over, and you can share your demo video there, and we can kind of walk through any questions that then come up from it.
Got it. Can you hear me? How do I sound?
Sound great.
Okay, so on the technical part of this presentation, and I did us a favor. I recorded this demo last night because I'm touching a virtual lab that all of the other engineers at Forescout use. And in the middle of the day, we end up with a lot of congestion. So I didn't want to have any delays. So by the way, can you see my screen right now? You should see call with Microsoft Teams. Is that visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so we're going to kick this off. This is a little over 8 minutes. After that, I have this lab up and running. Feel free to ask questions if there's something you want me to expand upon, dive a little bit deeper into. perfectly okay. And with that, here we go. Hello, Tom May here from Forescout. Today we'll be doing a brief demonstration of Forescout Zero Trust capabilities. And with all Forescout demonstrations,
Can you turn it up a little bit? It's a little low.
visibility is foundational to everything that Zero Trust needs to operate correctly. And in this view, within the dashboard, we're going to look at a very high-level view of what's on the network. The banner up top gives you the total count of devices. And we look down, we'll see asset types, Windows, networking, server, Mac, and so on. Operating systems, all those devices. The vendor and model, is it Cisco, is it Apple, is it Amazon? How we discovered those endpoints, the function they would fill, is it a mobile device, is it a computer, is it a networking device, and so on, as well as trending, what's coming on the network, what's going off the network with 24 hours there. And from a zero trust perspective, one of the things we are looking at from an ID management, going back to essential CMDB, how many of those devices that we have discovered are actually known to live on our CMDB? All of these widgets are active, which means I can pivot into any one of them. For instance, if we go into Windows, it brings up the asset view. And these are the details of the actual devices. If we pivot down into one a little bit closer, you'll see this is a fairly generic version of how Forscout presents this information. It's rich, it's contextual, and this allows Forscout, from a zero trust perspective, to really begin to apply some fairly sophisticated policy controls because we have the depth of knowledge on all these devices. And again, from a Forscout perspective, we can do this agentlessly and it's done dynamically. So this is real time data. Next thing we're going to do from a zero trust perspective is go look at compliance. On your network, from a zero trust perspective, this is important. First thing we look at, overall compliance status. 79%. If this is these numbers, you want these numbers to be high. And again, we can pivot in. We can look at this. You see that these are not compliant. Most of these are Apple or Cisco, some other things. And this would probably bear out some more investigation, or maybe there are VPN clients we see, maybe not. Depends upon your particular use case. We can also see compliance trending. Separate 24 hours, just like we do a custom list down here. We'll begin to see this. We can track things that change dynamically at a high level. If these numbers were to fluctuate really up or down, obviously that would be a point to investigate. But if you're not compliant, why would that be? So we would come over and begin to look at, again, this is policy driven on the back end. We're displaying what we already know. But here, very quickly, highly vulnerable devices, I can pivot into this. And based upon what we're concerned about, we see this here, and then we can obviously pull out any of those devices and investigate just a little bit further. But again, all this information is at your fingertips. And then you'll see things like the top 5 reasons why you're not compliant, applications which play a very important role in zero trust environments. We would want to keep an eye on these as well. But in a big picture, we're also looking at behavior. Who is talking to whom? And here you'll see an access violation going up to our HR system. We pivot down here, there's just 2 devices, example. But these 2 IP addresses obviously are trying to do something. They're trying to go to an HR system that we don't like. And what are they doing? Well, let's go have a look. So from here, the behavioral side would be found in the iSegment side of the Forscout continuum product. And this brings us to the matrix. The matrix shows us what groups are communicating with what other groups. And by groups, you'll see the sources here vertically, the destinations are horizontal. We have groups of different types of users, clients, network devices, and so on. And what we're really trying to understand when we look at this is this whole idea of desired behavior from a zero trust perspective. So to really explore that a little bit deeper, we're going to go look at the iSegment policy, which is a set of rules very much like we find in an ACL firewall right now. And we're looking at the HR system because we did have some violations there. So overall, we say anyone that's a member of the group users as a source going to a destination called the HR system, we would by default deny, with these 3 exceptions. First, generically speaking, users
can touch the web front end on ports 80 and 453. My Linux admin can touch the application side of that system over port 22. And then finally, my DB admin will touch the DB side of that back end over port 22 and 1433. Pretty standard stuff here. This is what you would actually expect to see. But we have violations, so let's go look at those violations now. So we go here and let's select that. Now our dots have gone from blue to yellow. Let's go and look at users going to our enterprise services. And let's pivot down to a more focused matrix. Here we expose the different types of users, sales, legal, finance, and so on. But let's go look at the sales guys. And let's go look at the actual traffic. What triggered this in the first place? And we do see users in the sales team going over to the database side of our HR system. We have 63 current instances of this. And look at this, they're trying to connect over port 22, which is something I would not expect. That would be a violation, certainly. And then when I look at the actual IPs, who's talking to who, I can pick any one of these and you'll see more data, more detail. We've got the violation, we've got details about the source, and the details about the destination. So with all of this, how do we tie this together? When you think about the big picture, a policy engine, policy decision point, and a policy enforcement point. And that's where we go into the Forscout policy engine itself. Let's go over here. We'll see under control. So we have violation defined. So our system, we find those same two IP addresses. Saying, well, what can we do about this? How do we complete the circle? We look at, get a little bit closer to how this rule is written and look at the logic. We find out that this rule triggers these actions. And very quickly, you've got a SOC incident being created and sent to service now. You've got forensic data about the endpoint and the violation heading over to Splunk for some type of forensic analysis. You've got our ability to tag this endpoint up to a next-gen firewall to stop its egress out to the internet, as well as putting an ACL locally on the switch port where we discovered it. And that could also be whether it was VPN, dropped session, or whether it was wireless, we could disassociate or change its access to the wireless access point. But this really, at the end of the day, this is the point where we're able to leverage the infrastructure as a policy enforcement point. So to begin with, we discovered it, found the devices, found who's compliant, found who's not, and then took an action to correct it. So putting all that together, back at a high level, one last time, you'll see that Forescout's firmly entrenched as both the policy engine and the decision, policy decision point. We're able to leverage the infrastructure as the policy enforcement point. As the subject comes on the network, attempts to connect, process that endpoint, and make a decision. And then if it's trusted, we allow access into the enterprise, resource, application, and data. And with that ends today's demonstration. And I do thank you for your time.
Okay. So do we have any questions in the group? Because we do have a little bit of time available to us. So I have a lab. We can bring this up and look at this. If you have any questions, we can do a deep dive. So I put that on the table for anyone that's interested. If not, back to you, Tim.
Yeah, great. We tried to keep the presentation to about 45 minutes. Thought maybe we'd get a couple of quick questions. I know some of these calls have had questions. Some of these calls have been pretty quiet after the vendor demos and then vendor deck, but I wanted to at least make sure we give everybody an opportunity to kind of talk through some of it.
Okay, then I'll go ahead and drop my share. And,
No problem.
and that is Tom's portion. Thank you very much.